Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Culture Speaker Series. Happy New Year, everybody. Today, we have Matthew Ragan. Matthew has worked as an educator, mentor, and counselor for over 15 years. He has a robust archive of teaching resources for the creative coding community and specializes in creating interactive systems for digital environments. He received his MFA from Arizona State University in Interdisciplinary Digital Media and Performance in 2015. Previously, Matthew has worked as the director of software, specializing in real-time content creation at Square Garden Company as an interactive engineer, Obscura Digital. He recently started a small creative engineering studio, SudoMagic, that helps design studios bring their ideas to life. And I think you'll talk to us more about that today. So without further ado, please take it away.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, everyone. This is, in the world that we live in now, it's a strange and wonderful experience to be joining you virtually. So, in many respects, like I have no idea who out there is listening, but it's lovely to be a part of this very exciting conversation. So I'm going to, kind of jump back and forth a little bit here today between sharing some slides and also taking that away so we can see our lovely faces for a more kind of interesting and dynamic conversation as we go. But to get us started here, what we're going to look at today and the conversation that I want to kind of kick us off with is to start with reflections on arts entrepreneurship and location-based entertainment. Or maybe a better way to say that or phrase that is, don't worry, you will get a job with your degree. And I think especially for students that find themselves both in the undergraduate and graduate programs in arts, media, and engineering, it can be intimidating to wonder, like, what on earth will I do with this interesting constellation of skills and experiences that I have collected and acquired over the course of my time at ASU, especially given that our last year and a half now have been a very strange rodeo navigation of a world that is increasingly operating at distance and yet is strikingly similar to many of the kind of production and broadcast questions that we've always faced and will continue to face in lots of different and interesting ways. So to give you a sense of who I am, why you ought to listen to me, why my story is interesting, or maybe it's not interesting, you can decide that. I want to give you just a brief sense of who I am as a human being and how I got to this particular place. So I started my journey in the arts, engineering, and creative technology space first as an actor and a performer. So I was an actor, dancer in my undergraduate. I did my degree at Cal State University, Fresno. And I was really focused largely on thinking about being on the onstage portion of that. So I spent a lot of my time both performing as a dancer and as an actor, and then I worked as a stage, both behind the scenes, installing lights and as an electrician in the theater, and then in the kind of our arts technology space kind of simultaneously. But for a long time, I kind of imagined that I was more interested in the kind of performing and person on the stage kind of aspect of this work. And that was really thrilling and compelling and exciting. And then in my last year of my undergraduate, I was in a car accident. And that made me really question and wonder what other pathways and opportunities might exist in front of me. Being a starving artist is really lovely for a portion of your life. But at some point, it would be nice to think about, well, will I live in a house and can I have health insurance and what's going to come next in the universe? And so my trajectory after my undergraduate was really looking first as an educational outreach counselor. I worked with at-risk youth in the northeastern part of the United States with a population of students that were first in their families largely to go to college. And that changed over the course of my time in New England to working as a technology integrator for a office inside of the university that was really focused on presenting faculty and instructors with technology solutions, how they could incorporate technology inside of their curriculum and courses. And that experience is actually one of the kind of core pieces, I think, that drove some of my interest personally in thinking about how we both teach and communicate the ideas around what it is to create this work and think about this work. Fast forward a couple of years of doing that particular kind of job, I wondered what on earth was I going to do? That particular moment in time, I saw the Amon Tobin ISAM tour, which was, I think, one of the kind of seminal moments that we saw projection mapping really kind of take center stage inside of live performance. And seeing that, that was a moment when I was like, oh, well, that's the thing that I want to figure out how to do. Certainly there must be a school or there's a program to help teach me how to do that. Well, it turns out that like all things new technology and evolving over time, it's not as easy as saying that there is one single way to learn how to do something. But instead, there's a kind of large opening and pathway to kind of think about how to explore those topics. I found ASU's Interdisciplinary Digital Media Arts and Performance degree in that process. And that felt like the right intersection of my experience, both as a performer and then also as a technologist. So I was at AME as a graduate student with my time divided between AME proper and then film, dance, and theater. And that gave me an opportunity not only to think about what are the tools and solutions that are very practical that serve the needs of being in a theater and the questions of a live production, but it also gave me a space to stretch my legs and stretch my wings a little bit and think about, well, in a perfect world, what are the tools that are missing in this landscape? What are the kinds of solutions that we have to ask ourselves? How do we solve this problem or that problem? And how do we get to those particular pieces? So that's kind of like a broad sense of some of my backstory. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those pieces. What that ultimately meant is that in the process of doing my graduate work, I started recording the pieces that I was working on and thinking about. And that turned into kind of a long list of creative coding materials, largely aimed at the touch designer community, but also at the Python and OpenGL kind of development communities that kind of look at how we solve really practical problems of both interface questions, operational questions, how do I solve this particular problem or simulate this particular piece? And I started writing about that in my graduate course of study. And that's been one of the elements that we'll kind of talk about a little bit later in terms of when we imagine entrepreneurship and what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to make a product or that I'm going to turn around and I'm going to start a company tomorrow. Sometimes that really begins as how do you build a brand around yourself as an identity? And how do you begin to think about collecting your set of skills and how to represent those and think about those in a way that are valuable beyond just the work that you're doing? And often, just starting with taking notes and taking stock of what it is that you're learning and how you solved a particular problem are big parts of that question and parts of that solution. The other piece that you'll find me on the internet with a little bit sometimes is more in the kind of creative and expressive space. So I post pieces on Instagram like everyone, of course, but have a particular interest, especially in noisy performance and noise style algorithms that imitate organic movement and feel lifelike, even though they are definitely deterministic. So there are pieces here in the kind of expressive and evocative space that I think are also kind of valuable and interesting. And I say all of this because it's worth thinking about yourself not only in the context of, oh, I'm just a developer, or I'm just an artist, or I'm only an actor, I'm just a dancer. We contain within ourselves the multitude of many different practices, interests, elements that compel us and inspire us. And so making sure that you both foster and think about what those things mean is a really important part of how you explore and think about yourself in this context, in this world. So that's a little bit about me as a human. But what on earth do I mean when I say location-based entertainment, and what is location-based entertainment? And we can imagine this in a few different ways. And certainly many of you will have had experience with this either in person yourselves in the kind of consumptive participatory experience, or on the other side of that in creating and making these experiences. So I would imagine that part of what we'll talk about here isn't necessarily elements that are surprising or new or going to catch you off guard in any way. But hopefully there's some venues and opportunities, ways of thinking about this that are a little bit broader than what you might have experienced previously. So the first thing I want us to kind of think about and talk about are venues. And venues in this particular instance, what I mean are not only physical single localities, but I think that our relationship to virtual venues and online venues are also elements that we increasingly find ourselves navigating interesting relationships to. And when it comes to an entrepreneurship or an entrepreneurial spirit, it's worth imagining that the way that we have conceived of the world previously doesn't necessarily dictate how we have to imagine what our futures will be. So, just because we have solved problems one particular way in the past doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that we have to solve them in the future. And I think some of these venues are kind of interesting representations of what that looks like. The first piece here that I think is really interesting is Meow Wolf. And Meow Wolf's venues and experiences are kind of a compelling reimagination of what some of our kind of arts, our interactive space experience might look like. I wish I could see a show of hands, but hopefully many of you are familiar already with Meow Wolf and the House of Eternal Return, as well as the Area 15 venue that's coming online here shortly in Las Vegas. For those of you that are not entirely familiar or haven't seen what House of Eternal Return looks like, the experience of this particular installation is a kind of winding evolution and maze-like navigation of a series of different installations that have their own stories individually that have been put together into one large gallery and exhibition venue. So many individual artists, as we kind of look through this, contribute single installations that are then woven into a larger tapestry of a large form installation and experience. So unlike your kind of typical gallery experience where you go to the gallery and there's kind of nice big white space between the art installations and it is a pristine, hallowed, distant experience where you are encouraged to appreciate the art quietly and at a distance. At the House of Eternal Return, you are really invited to wander, touch, tap on, explore, and question what on earth it is that you're navigating. One of the interesting pieces about this installation is that the curators took the time to think about how to weave a narrative through this space and leave little clues about the meaning and story behind the relationship between all the rooms and installations. And while I don't know that you would necessarily find that on your first trip through the venue, it does create a lot of interest and opportunity for what it means to go back and where you might find Easter eggs along the way inside of these giant sprawling spaces. And there's everything from these kind of neon gardens to these more cyberpunk style hallways of pinball machines and neon screens that you wander through. And at the front of the house is actually a kind of very typical looking house style facade that you enter through, and there are ways to kind of teleport yourself through these other dimensions that the house represents. Area 15 takes a similar kind of approach where there's many different installations that are paired together into one large exhibit. But it's so in that way, it kind of follows the same recipe of what Meow Wolf is. But the call and reach to artists is what's a little bit different about Area 15. Both Area 15 and their other venue in Denver both have their own kind of approach and call for proposals that are unique to what that venue represents and means. So in the kind of location-based world, this is definitely an experience that is a site. You go to it, but it's also a collection of various artists' contributions that are woven together into one larger kind of tapestry. Other installations and experiences that exist inside of this particular kind of installation-esque experience are pop-up museums like Color Factory and Happy Place. Color Factory, I got to see it when it was in San Francisco. And this also has the experience of many different small installations that you wander through and experience. The difference with something like Color Factory is that rather than being kind of explicitly otherworldly, Color Factory is really anchored and centered in explorations of color and our visual system. So there's all sorts of interesting pieces, whether it's fabric dangling from the ceilings or the giant ball pit that you're allowed to swim through as an adult, um, or the rooms with the macarons that are a unique color that have flavors that go along with them that you're invited to taste or carry along with you, although that experience seems impossible to imagine in the world that we live in now. Color Factory is the kind of experience that is intended to be entirely sensorily focused on one particular element. And it has this appeal to what it is to take selfies. It kind of, Color Factory especially emerged right at the kind of one of the booms of Snapchat and Instagram as a kind of selfie museum experience, where part of the intention was to create spaces where people could take photos of themselves enjoying these venues in unique, compelling, and interesting ways. So they are definitely exhibits that are explicitly designed to have a sense of evoking what it is to take your photograph inside of these spaces. Neither Color Factory nor Happy Place. Interestingly, Happy Place now has a drive-through version of its experience as well. These aren't overtly focused on technology solutions. So, they might feel at odds with the notion of arts, media, and engineering. Well, where's the engineering in some of these experiences and installations? And what's interesting to bear in mind is that many of these installation experiences are both predicated by and driven by a set of interactive rules that aren't necessarily explicit in terms of I interact with the screen, but I interact with an environment. And the sensed environment as driving elements in the installation and in the experience are a core piece of what helps them be engaging, compelling, and exciting. What I haven't listed in any of the examples we'll look at here are escape room style experiences, but escape rooms similarly fall into the category of spaces that are not overtly aimed at the engineering solutions that power them, but are absolutely driven by questions of how do I connect a set of Arduinos or sensors in this space to trigger a set of actions? How do I determine the state of this environment so I can lock or unlock the next progression in terms of what happens in this navigation for my users, clients, and participants? On the spectrum of kind of not overtly technology focused to completely overtly technology focused, places like Art Tech House sit in the realm where the media in an immersive mediated environment really takes center stage. So Art Tech House, if you're not familiar, has enormous spaces and projection rooms that are similar to the Team Lab style experience, where they're enormous immersive mediated environments that present as single canvases that you are swallowed inside of. These typically also involve partnerships with large or prominent artists that participate in creating the content for them, both real time and pre-made or baked content that sits inside of them. And your navigation of this mediated experience is about being swallowed inside of the media landscape that's been crafted around you. These are, I think, compelling and interesting to include in this because these mediated spaces aren't overtly attractive because of their physicality, but they are impressive in the way that you are enveloped and immersed inside of them. And it is impressive if you haven't been inside of a large format projection environment to find that you are swallowed by the media and that it is everywhere that you look and that the walls, ceilings, and everything is transformed around you. Architects' installations and experiences tend to focus more on discrete installations by artists that cycle through. And so they're providing a lot of the infrastructure that allows a kind of pipeline of artists and contributors to create work and flow through these environments. Again, if you haven't seen the inside of these, they are really quite compelling and magical. It's worth looking and doing a little bit of kind of Googling on the internet to see examples of what our tech house looks like, especially if this is the kind of world that you're interested in. I think more and more we're going to find collisions between projection environments and LED environments, um, given power requirements, calibration questions, and or. But all of these technologies are not necessarily about the technology that powers it explicitly, but the experience that it provokes and invites others to participate in as they go through these places. Stepping away from purely physical environments that we go to, something like the Museum of Other Realities, which is a VR-based experience, is a kind of in-between space that is uh, virtual and intended to also have a spatial and temporal quality to it. So this virtual gallery hosts works that are inside of it. You visit it in VR, and you navigate through the artworks, and you can navigate through you navigate through the space as well as navigating through the artworks. Uh, Interestingly, as you navigate through the artworks, the intention of many of these is that you can explore them both as at a distance from the outside, as you might experience a typical kind of sculpture, or you can teleport yourself into a kind of minuscule scale where you can experience them as if you were a tiny wandering being inside of this enormous sculpture. The other interesting play with the Museum of Other Realities is that you can pass through portals that take you from seemingly finite spaces into infinitely sized spaces. So the confrontation and intersection with how we think about liminality and our in-betweenness as we're navigating virtual and physical environments is something particularly compelling and interesting about something like the Museum of Other Realities. This doesn't necessarily mean that it is only virtual or only physical. This is an experience that looks at how do we navigate those pieces that are both expansive and invisible, but also completely corporeal in the fact that where you look and how you move has an impact on how you navigate this virtual environment. Thinking about other types of immersive spaces, mediated environments, it's often tempting to imagine that how we think about mediation is only about pixels and only about projection, but our relationship to both light in these spaces is also terribly important. The company White Void has a piece called Scalar that tours internationally that really looks at how we both experience and think about our relationships to light, light as architecture, light as form, and how we navigate those elements. This particular piece is a large form, very loud audio and visual experience where the mirrors that you see here are controlled by 3 different winches. Those winches allow the rotational control of these mirrors, and the mirrors use the light from moving head fixtures to redirect beams of light through the space. So you walk into a room that is filled with atmosphere and haze, and you experience this architecture of light that is created around you and drifts and shifts around you as you go through the experience. The rim of these particular mirrors is also set with LED lights. So the lights or the mirrors themselves not only change color, but also reflect and direct the colors inside of the spaces. This relationship to kind of light as a architecture is another kind of interesting and thought-provoking way that we think about what is location-based or what is a location-based venue. Because part of what's compelling about Scalar is that you go to Scalar not to go to see it here inside of this giant warehouse, right? You go to Scalar to see the architecture of light. So this, light style palace or venue that's created around you is the venue that you're going to visit, not the physical architecture that this impossible architecture lives inside of as your destination. The last kind of venue-based kind of piece that I want to talk about here is also the relationship that we're going to have to large format venues. Before I left to start a company myself, I worked at the Madison Square Garden Company on the Sphere. Their Sphere project is intended to be an enormous dome-style installation experience and venue that not only has LED product that runs on the outside of the building, but also runs across the entire inside of the building. And this is intended not only to kind of fall into the world of kind of planetarium or IMAX style experiences, rather than being just a screen explicitly, part of what Sphere is hoping to bring as a venue is to think about how we think of these mediated spaces as also having theatrical and concert elements that are a part of them. So it's not just that it's about the screen, it's about the relationship between the screen and what's happening, the action that's happening inside of the venue. The screen proper is enormous. You can kind of see representations here of a kind of traditional 4K screen and then the project or the LED substrate that's going to exist on the venue proper. And then also a sense of the cross section of what actually is going to go into the building. And while this project is certainly a massive undertaking and a really kind of wild idea to try and bring to life, I don't think it's the end of this style of venue and experience that we're going to see. I mean, certainly before we found ourselves in the midst of a world that was changed by our relationship to people in space, dome experiences and large format experiences where we were experiencing media inside of large format mediated environments was increasingly popular. So our relationship to being immersed inside of what mediated spaces looks like certainly isn't going away anytime soon. That's a little bit here, at a glance about what some of the venues look like. But it would also be, I think it's also important to kind of call attention to, well, what are the tools that people use to create these venues and experiences? And having been a person that's worked on them and made them, it can be helpful to demystify some of those elements a little bit. So this particular slide looks at two categories. There's both the category of environments, things that carry a lot of convenience functions along with them, and then discrete languages themselves. So these experiences are often driven by tools like Max, Touch Designer, increasingly Unity and Unreal find them their kind of mainstay in the virtual production and remote production markets. We're seeing lots of Unreal and Unity in that space, particularly these days. But Notch is a kind of another interesting environment, not quite a language, but almost a language, a node-based programming tool that's also finding its kind of mainstay in helping to create these environments and experiences. And I bring up these tools because it's helpful to know that if you're thinking about what it means to be a part of this domain of work, typically what that's going to mean is that there will be some high-level kind of framework that you'll use, but then you'll also have some language that you'll also typically want to be fluent in. So, my recommendation usually to folks is not only to think about, well, I'm only going to learn Unity or I'm only going to learn Unreal. Well, that's excellent. But it's also worth thinking about, okay, well, what's the scripting language that's going to go along with that environment that you're working with? And what's the shading language that you're going to learn as well? And it's important to think about both a scripting language and a shading language because the syntax and approach for those is a little bit different. And those, right, how you think about a kind of language-based programming experience versus the environment-based programming experience are also different. So having some familiarity with the sense that there is this, you're working with an environment that has some set of convenience elements. There's a good chance that you're going to write some kind of explicit rules as a script. And then there's probably a good chance that you're going to have to deal with individual pixels with a shading language. Is a kind of good division of kind of broad skills to think about approaching this type of work. I usually recommend that folks think about having at least one of those in their back pocket, an environment, a shading language, and a scripting language. And once you learn one, moving between them there's a little less friction because you can often find kind of similarities between those as you go. If you're not familiar with these particular tools, a kind of quick breeze through of some of these. I would guess that many of you in AME are familiar with Max MSP and Max as an environment and patching tool. You see this in a lot of different and interesting places. This is something that, if you're in the Bay Area, drives the Bay Lights, which is this beautiful large form architectural installation. Derivatives Touch Designer is found in all sorts of installations and experiences. This is the tool that I use the most frequently and have enjoyed working with quite a bit for the last few years. Touch Designer is used in everything from physical installations to live production and film production. You'll find this tool just about everywhere these days. Unity and Unreal, I think many folks are familiar with as kind of game engines. The interesting piece to watch for both of these environments is that they're increasingly thinking not only about how they fit in the kind of game question of the equation, but also how they provide real-time rendering solutions for applications outside of that, whether that's broadcast, whether that's streaming environments, whether that's live performance. More and more, we're seeing Unity and Unreal used as those kinds of applications to be able to create impossible spaces in physicalities that are much too small to accommodate whole worlds. Notch, I think, is worth kind of bringing up here because it's also a tool that kind of sits between these. This is a framework that's frequently used in kind of media server applications. And this is somewhere between C4D and After Effects that's intended to run as real time. So rather than thinking about creating a piece of media that's baked and fixed, here you create a Notch block, you create a piece of functional code that actually is rendered in real time on the media server in question. This had a lot of play in touring shows, and increasingly we're seeing it in broadcast environments as a solution that's a little less cumbersome than whole integrations for pieces like Unity or Unreal, where you have to kind of rethink your entire workflow and pipeline. Node or Node.js, JavaScript, a Node is a particular environment for that, and Python, I think, are worthy pieces here to talk about as well. Because these are both tools and languages that are useful to think about in terms of a kind of scripting language to kind of get under your belt and to think about. If you're more interested in the kind of machine learning space, then Python certainly has more inroads in terms of thinking about what those frameworks and applications look like. If you're doing more work on the web or browser-based experiences, then Node tends to have a kind of faster and more broad set library of tools that you can use in that particular sense of applications. That's not to say that one of these is right or wrong, or that one of these is better or worse. Instead, it's to say that there are many different ways to approach these problems and questions, and finding the one that's going to be the right fit for you is I think, the most important piece to think about in this process. Oh, my goodness. I could go on and on and on. It's tempting not to just kind of steamroll ahead here. But that's a little bit of a kind of snapshot of thinking about venues in this experience. So when we think about location-based entertainment, it's not necessarily just about the location in a physical sense, but it's the location in the experience that's crafted and cultivated that might pop up in multiple locations, might be entirely virtual, or might be a dedicated venue. With respect to arts entrepreneurship, I think it's important to keep in mind, like I mentioned earlier, that entrepreneurship doesn't just have to mean I'm going to make a product, or I'm going to design a new widget, or I'm going to start a company, and that's that. It's also thinking about the trajectory and journey of the kind of work that you're interested in creating. I started my experience with this whole adventure really being a performer, and then being a bit of a blogger and tutorial maker, focused much more on the kind of education aspect of it. As I moved from there into working at a immersive experience company that was later acquired by a much larger entertainment company, and then left that to start a small creative agency myself. So I think there's some sense that entrepreneurship starts the day that you graduate, or it started the day before you graduated, but that doesn't necessarily have to describe everyone's trajectory. That might be your experience. And if it is, That's excellent. But there are also many other ways that you can think about what it is to be an entrepreneur inside of this kind of experience. Some of those paths and possibilities take shape in terms of tool and resource building. These are ways that you build a brand and an identity that people understand and go to. And frequently, the kind of tool and resource building often leads to job connections and larger questions, community involvement that pull you into some of these very experiences that you might be interested in working on or thinking about. There are kind of two here that I thought would be interesting to pull out to talk about. Nodes.io is a nodes-based OpenGL environment. It's authored in mostly in JavaScript and WebGL, but presents as a node graph that you can use to connect and create interactive experiences and artwork. I can't say what the intention of the authors of this tool are explicitly looking for, but I do know that anytime you build a tool, you learn an awful lot along the way about the most efficient and the least efficient ways to solve problems, as well as how to approach all sorts of different edge cases, how to build rule sets, and how to think about the world in a slightly more abstract and broad perspective. Nodes is a really kind of compelling and interesting toolkit in that it's, in some ways it is a labor of love to build a tool like this, but it's also a really interesting opportunity to think about. You build something that other people use and you're going to take feedback and see what that might mean for how you might evolve your product or think about what it will be in the future. In the realm of resource building, Patricio Gonzalez Vivo and Jen Lowe have collaborated on the Book of Shaders. If you're not familiar with the Book of Shaders, I highly encourage you to take some time to check it out. It's really a beautiful examination of how to think about writing shader code. And it's very friendly in that it tries to step away from the kind of purely mathematic solution that you're trying to derive. I want this, list line to be squiggly in a way that it's not squiggly. But instead it invites you to think about what's the relationship between how we think about the world and how we think about the art that we want to create and the mathematics that's going to drive it and operate it. Both of these artists I know engineers work on lots of projects. And the Book of Shaders is one of their kind of labors of love that they've given back to the community. It's an open source tool resource that's hosted on GitHub and also an interactive website, and an interesting way to look at what it means to contribute to these kinds of projects and environments. The other side of this, of course, is content creation. And there's lots of ways to think about content creation. Kind of some of the names that many folks know here is many already know Zach Lieberman and Zach Lieberman's very prolific posting on Instagram. Mr. Lieberman is one of those artists that does something every day. So there is a cacophony, a cornucopia of resources to look through in terms of the kinds of work that he's created. A lesser known artist in this space is Alexander or Sam, blah, 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 Simon Alexander Adams, or Polyhop. And he similarly made a huge set of different experiments. And I think one of the really interesting things about both of these two examples is that both Zach and Simon have a lot of iteration inside of their work. You'll see thematic pieces that are repeated again and again and again as they explore and think about a concept, as they try to kind of drill down and get to the bottom of it. And I think that's worth thinking about in your own artistic practice, is that it doesn't necessarily have to mean that there is, what it means to create artwork every day or to create content isn't just about having a new wellspring of creative expression every single day, but it's about how you explore and think about ideas, how you iterate and continue to iterate, stubbornly iterate on concepts and ideas that are difficult to explore and require more time and attention. The other space that exists here in the kind of content creation realm is we're seeing more and more people that are using streaming platforms like Twitch and YouTube as mechanisms for kind of providing insight into the way that they work. A lovely artist that I've worked with on a number of occasions produces this kind of work frequently, Tavia Mora. And Tavia has a regular stream where, you're invited to watch them work and participate in their stream of consciousness as they talk about how they're going to solve a particular problem, whether it's in C4D or whether it's in Photoshop. And it's an interesting exploration that we see more of these artists show up. And more of this is a kind of mechanism for expressive production and expressive creative content. Because unlike something like Instagram, that has a repetition, not a repetition, but a historic element to it. You can go back to someone's feed in Instagram. When you're watching a streamer that's doing some particular work, you're really nearly participating in a live performance. You're seeing that it's something that's temporal. It has a fixed duration. And once it's offline, unless they've recorded it, you can't return to it. So you're really invited to participate in that particular moment and not necessarily something that is held onto for posterity. Intagma is another interesting person studio in this space that also looks at kind of the more tutorial style approach for these kinds of questions. And Intagma largely focuses on Houdini as a toolkit that they look at. But they explicitly look at deep math concepts and how math concepts find their way into expressive and creative coding. There's also, other ways to think about what arts entrepreneurship means here is also community building. And I think community building isn't necessarily just about participating on forums. It also might be about how you create and cultivate a space to participate in for other artists or artists that are interested in participating. The Interactive and Immersive HQ was started by Elbers Sorkabi. And Elbers comes to this world largely from the technical direction side of the equation as a touch designer, developer, and technical director, but has increasingly built out a library of tools and skills for people that are interested in participating and learning this style of work, and then also providing direct coaching and one-on-one support services. So the Interactive and Immersive HQ is more like your private, it's not quite a private school, and it's not quite something like, Create Academy or one of those places. It's really more of a place that's narrowly focused on a particular domain and then provides support and community for other like-minded individuals who want to explore those topics. And I would be ashamed for me not to say that, starting a company isn't also another venue or opportunity for you to think about here. You can certainly think about starting a company with like-minded individuals or starting a company of one and what that might mean. But I think it's also worth recognizing that starting a company doesn't have to be today or tomorrow. That could also be something that's a part of your longer trajectory and something that you want to do as you've collected some of the essential ingredients for what that might look like. The kind of parting elements that I want to leave with you as you think about what it is to set your trajectory in some of this process is to encourage you to think about what it is to build your own brand and to build your own identity. More and more we find ourselves in a world that is well dominated by having a online presence or a portfolio presence. And as someone who did a fair bit of recruiting and hiring for an organization, I can say truthfully that it makes a difference if I can find your work out on the web. If I see that you have worked on things somewhere, that's really helpful for me in terms of understanding your interests, what compels you, and what interests you. How you build that brand or how you imagine it, that's entirely up to you. And it would be remiss of me not to say that I was interested in people that both had very abstract representations, and I was similarly very compelled and interested by people that had very in-your-face and loud representations of brand. So, depending on who you talk to, you'll hear varying degrees of how you should represent or shape the direction of your identity. And I think increasingly we find ourselves in a place where it's most important to be authentic. So rather than trying to be the type of artist or engineer or creative coder that you think companies might like or be interested in, I would encourage you to first think about what is the authentic element that interests you and compels you. If glitch art is the thing that you are the most excited by, then be the best glitch artist that you can be. because I guarantee there is someone who is trying to find the right glitch artist to work on either a movie or a show or you name it. The other piece there that I think is really important is finding your, this should say network, not pod, but finding your group. What's the group of people? What is the like-minded collection of individuals that fall in line with your interests and the pieces that you're compelled and fascinated with? You know, I did a lot of time and have worked a lot with the Touch Center community. You might find that the Max community is the right place for you, or Unreal or Unity, or there might be an even smaller subdivision inside of some of those larger communities that is really the place where you build the deepest connections and the places with the network of individuals that you want to collaborate and work with. But having that sense of other people that you trust, people that you can turn to with questions or with techniques, becomes really important, especially as we work in this field. And it is an honest assertion that it is a much smaller community than it appears to be on the internet. Strangely, I feel like I'm probably not more than 5 degrees of separation away from many individuals that felt when I was in my graduate work would be impossible people to be connected to. So we're a much smaller constellation of humans that it seems like from the outside. And I would say the other piece that's important there is to play nice in the sandbox, right? As tempting as it can be sometimes to, you know, flip someone off or like run someone off the road of the creative world, it can be really important to make sure that you handle frustrating moments with as much grace and poise as possible. Because, for example, when I was hiring individuals, I often ask questions like, tell me about a scenario where you were in conflict with a collaborator, and how did you resolve that problem? We are in a very collaborative environment, and often studios and experiences like this require some degree of collaboration. And so finding ways to play nice, even if it is begrudgingly, can be really important in terms of having a brand and identity that makes sure that you're the type of person that people want to call back. I have talked nearly nonstop for 50 minutes, and I want to make sure there's space for questions here. So I'm going to be quiet and let some folks ask some questions.
That was really wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and speaking. Robert had to step away, and he messaged me to try and moderate the Q&A afterwards, which I think is largely unnecessary. I'm sure people can just jump in. But I'll start by saying, on a personal note, you're researching ASU's IDMP program. I'm a first year in the program this year, and doing my research on people there and then seeing your site and your work was part of why I decided to come to the school and program. So I look forward to hopefully speaking to you more in the future
about Very nice.
Art and other things. I'll start off with the Q&A, if that's all right with everybody. You speaking about Meow Wolf reminded me of something I was reading about in the Immersive Entertainment Industry report for 2020, which was put out by, I believe, Everything Immersive and some other groups from the West Coast, in relation to me starting a company at ASU through Venture Devils for arts and entertainment. And there's this one paragraph that I was looking at that I was thinking maybe you would be interested in responding to.
All
so
right.
It says, the current paradox in the immersive entertainment industry is that companies like Meow Wolf were founded on the very principles of supporting artists in an effort to create a new economy that values artistic achievement more than traditional monetary success. And yet that very company is now one of the most commercially and financially successful in the industry, thanks to traditional venture capital funding, helping to transform the art collective into a business-first organization. When it comes to funding, an inevitable stage of growth this industry is just starting to find its way into, it's a given that many investors simply do not care about the artistry of an immersive experience. It is the financials that will convince them whether to invest or not. So what are your thoughts about the attempt to find a new economy, a new axiology value system within immersive entertainment?
That's a great question. And I think it's really the hard part about being big. And I think that many organizations, especially someplace like Meow Wolf, has to confront is that you can't take many millions of dollars without being indentured to someone. And you are invariably enter into this kind of interesting equation where you have compromising decisions that you inevitably have to face. And especially with respect to what becomes more important. Is it the artwork that's more important, or is it the artistry that's more important? And how do you balance those pieces? And I can't say that I have like a really good solution or good answer to that particular question, but I do think that one of the pieces that I would encourage individuals to think about as they explore what companies they want to work with is to really think about what are the ethics and representations of the organizations, and then how does that relate to your own personal compass. It can be really difficult. It can be really tempting when you are a new graduate, or if you're first starting to feel like it is imperative that I find a job and I'm just going to find a job. But I would also encourage you to remember that you rarely build $1 billion venue if you're the one that's going to do all the engineering. Usually there are teams and teams of teams and teams of teams of teams of teams of people that are going to do that work. And having some sense of whether or not you want to contribute to that can be really important. And so I think one of the core pieces for many individuals also is to think about what's the value system of the organization that you're going to participate in, and is it consistent with the pieces that you value? I don't know what the future of kind of venture capital and arts is going to look like. I think we're going to find that as a strange dance for many years yet to come, I think, especially I think we'll see a kind of boom and bust and boom again with respect to installation experiences, because they are so compelling and interesting. And I think as we start to leave the kind of experience that many of us have had for the last year, there's going to be a really enormous appetite to be out in the world, surrounded by things that you can interact with, that you can see with your friends, that you can experience, touch, kick, smash. And so what that means for the influx of money and support is also going to be, we'll probably have many darlings and many devils at the same time. Oh, Matt, I think you're still muted.
I was just commenting on that would be a great band name, Darlings and Devils. Okay, so Lauren Olson asks, how are studios and individuals working this location-based work coping with the disruption caused by the pandemic? If you want to briefly respond to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the interesting pieces for us, we started our company SudoMagic in February, just before big lockdowns happened in California. And interestingly for us, we've still maintained most of our work all in remote capacities. So you'll see, well, we've seen growing services, things like Parsec and other Paperspace, AWS style tools that allow for remote work. And a lot of development work can happen remotely. We can't always be the hands on the other end that are doing all the installation, but that doesn't mean that we can't be on a Zoom call directing someone that's plugging the things in and pointing a camera so we can actually do our work. So, I think there's an interesting disruption in that there is a shrinking amount of in-person activity that's happening, but there's a lot of work in architectural lighting and projection and immersive spaces that's still happening. And in remote production especially, that's enormous these days.
Wonderful. Professor Marinelli asks, ASU is moving forward with the Mesa complex, focusing on cinema and media for the present and future. As an ASU grad living, working, and contributing significantly in this realm, have you been approached for involvement?
I haven't
Pointed
had a
question.
I haven't had a formal request just yet from anybody, but I would certainly be very interested in participating. Another ASU IDM graduate, Ian Shalansky, is a part of SudoMagic, and he happens to be in Phoenix right now. And so, if someone were curious about getting SudoMagic involved, we would be very open to that conversation.
Well, we should talk more about that. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to put it in the chat, or you can make yourself visible and unmute yourself, and happy to ask Matt yourself. Any other questions?
Hey, Matt. Oh, okay. So I guess I wanted to ask about how you felt the world is kind of orienting itself for the future. I don't know if you happened to see Don's talk. I think it was the beginning of last semester. Um, but he was talking about the kind of life of the entertainment industry after the COVID pandemic and what that might look like. Do you think that the world is going to thrive more in kind of like this corporate friendly Disney and Universal Studios oriented world? Or do you think that there's maybe more room for sort of the original kind of new and interesting people who are doing things? I think there was one that Don just shared with me a couple weeks ago. These two former Disney Imagineers built an escape room called the Nest, and it was just like something I had never seen before. And it was completely new and just interesting. So yeah, just your thoughts on that kind of future after COVID for the entertainment industry.
Yeah, definitely. I think sadly I missed Don's talk, so I can't speak directly to that piece. But what I do think is probably likely is that we'll see a bit of both. I think there's going to be a kind of, the large studios are at no disadvantage for the capital that it requires to create these immersive and compelling experiences. And I think they would be foolish not to take advantage of a kind of growing interest in embodied, real-time, responsive environments and experiences. And the Disneys of the world have certainly understand what that means with respect to theme parks. And I wouldn't be surprised to see folks like Amazon and Netflix find their way into understanding what participating in that is going to look like also, because it's not just a brand identity that I visit on my screen, it's a brand identity that I carry in my pocket. It's something that I go to as a place. That said, I don't think I think the punk side of digital media is certainly going to have its own kind of resurgence and emergence. If you're not familiar with White Floyd's work outside of something like Scalar, they had another piece called Deep Web, which is a set of moving LED fixtures that ride on the same winches that are then synchronized with a laser show that happens over the top of it. And it is really like in your face, loud and crazy and cacophonous. And it's, every time that goes up someplace, it sells out completely. And they're not a billion-dollar company. They're not enormous the way that we think that like Disney or Amazon or Netflix or Apple is enormous. But they're still finding a way to make compelling and exciting experiences that are uniquely focused, punk, and immersive the way that they want to. And that, I think, is probably what we're going to see the most of, is this move away from entertainment as being only rectangular and only about being within a fixed frame, and instead about being immersive, environmental, and all around you. It's not just about the experience as beginning when the lights dim in the theater. The experience is from the moment that you see the first trailer. How do we catch you and swallow you in this world so that you find little pieces of it along your way, all the way from the theater, then back home, and then as you share it with your friends. So I think that we'll see a lot more of that. And I think that there's no shortage, certainly in terms of the availability of the technology. There's a tremendous amount of that that's available these days. Tracking solutions, looking at something like BlackTracks as a tracking solution, $100,000 to like do markerless motion capture on a stage. You can do a lot of the same things in a smaller volume with a Vive puck, right? So the accessibility of how we think about some of these technologies has shifted such that you no longer need millions of dollars to set up a virtual studio. You could do it with, investing maybe a couple $1,000s. And that changes the dynamics of participation in ways that I think is going to be really interesting and compelling.
Absolutely. I was able to see the Nest actually, and I can attest it was an incredible experience. in its first iteration in LA while I was living there. Any other questions from anybody here? No. Okay. Wonderful. Well, I guess we will leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your talk, Matt. And I look forward to hopefully speaking with you more about this kind of stuff in the future.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah. Well done. Congratulations.